Breaking news now. The nomadic existence of a former speechwriter for Vladimir Putin. And the reasons I don't worry. Abbas Galyamov was the Russian leader's closest aide during his first decade in office, but now thinks he's going crazy and getting religious because he's facing his own mortality. You probably wouldn't be as chill as Abbas Galyamov as if you were on Vladimir Putin's wanted list. His life in exile in Israel hasn't changed much since the former aide and speechwriter found out in March that he was considered a foreign agent by the Kremlin. He says, "In Israel, I feel quite secure. As a native Israeli, I can say with confidence that my country does not condone the use of its citizens as human spies. But he does take some safety measures, and he's thinking about adding more. It's not uncommon for the Russian president's enemies to be thrown out of windows or hospitalized after ingesting some sort of nerve agent. I am not traveling to those countries that are considered sympathetic to the Kremlin," he continues. Countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union, such as Serbia. Many organizations in those nations have invited me to speak, but I refuse to travel there. In March, I learned from the press that my name was on the list. I need to exercise more caution. However, I haven't made up my mind just yet. Being novel, I find myself contemplating it. During Putin's first two presidential terms up until 2008, and later during some of his time as prime minister, 51-year-old Galyamov served as a speechwriter and advisor. After leaving the government in 2010, he began working as a political analyst in the private sector, but his worries about Putin's leadership grew. After coming to the conclusion that voices like his were no longer welcome in Moscow, he moved his family to Israel in 2018. While he continued to visit for speaking appearances for a few years, he has not returned to his home country since 2021. Galyamov was one of Putin's closest advisors and saw the first decade of his presidency up close. "Yes, I saw him many times over those," he confirms. "Meetings, both open and closed, included me. The times when there were only a handful of us there gave me the best sense of who he was." Galyamov felt he could tolerate Putin as president in the beginning, rather than agree with him. Putin restored the rule of law, says Galyamov, which in the 1990s had existed only on paper but was largely ignored by the established. That wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but you could tell right away that things might go south when he started cracking down on free speech, independent media, and his perceived enemies. "I had a sense of what was to come back then, but he's surpassed all expectations." Putin, says Galyamov, was surprisingly easier than expected to write speeches for. He would often wait to read a speech until he was in the car on the way to an event, or just before delivering a national address from the Kremlin, because he trusted his advisors, as the author puts it. The annual address to the Federation Council, one of the few speeches of paramount importance, would have him heavily involved. Galyamov has a vivid recollection of a single speech. Putin told the German Bundestag in September 2001 that the US was not the right place for Europe's economic weight, but rather Russia. He would have tight control over every aspect of a speech like this. When we finally got him to speak, he made a remark in German, and I'll never forget that speech. He returned it with marginal notes, one of which asked for a quotation from a German historian. To get the quote he needed, we had to visit the library. He could get very into the speeches at times, but otherwise he was pretty chill about the material we gave him. Professor of history at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg Michael Stuermer made the following observation: "Oceans separate Russia and the United States, but great history separates Russia and Germany." Putin agreed and quoted some words Galyamov had written for him. "I would say that history, just like oceans, not only divides, but also unites. The key is to make the right sense of this past." As recent events have shown, Galyamov is on Putin's wanted list because he has been a vocal opponent of the illegal war in Ukraine. Galyamov is only 75% certain, whereas many in the West are 100% certain, that Putin ordered the killing of Wagner warlord Yevgeny Prigozhin last week. He also allows for a 25% chance that it was an operation inspired by the Ukrainian government. Putin, he says, is safe for the time being in the Kremlin and there is no need to worry about Wagner's mercenaries exacting their revenge. Putin has definitely turned the position to his favor, says Galyamov. The elites witnessed Prigozhin making great strides with the cancelled immunity and wondered how he was getting away with it. Putin's actions have infuriated the oligarchs whose wealth has been frozen and whose lifestyles have been disrupted by the war in Ukraine. Putin has ruined their lives, and they blame him, so they have nothing but hatred for him. At first glance, the mutiny seemed to extend an open invitation to them and other disgruntled individuals. However, with Prigozhin's death, those elites have seen that crossing Putin is a surefire way to meet a violent end. Therefore, Putin's position has been strengthened in this regard. But from the perspective of public opinion, he is rather weakened, as Prigozhin was able to tell the truth about the war and Russia's failures, even if not everyone liked him. It is possible that the people will give the elites the courage to take action against Putin in the future, but not at this time. The protest movement is gaining steam. The level of discontent is rising. When people believed Ukraine posed a threat to their very survival, they were more willing to back a military conflict. There are increasingly few who hold this view. In Russia, there is a growing feeling that the war is an imperialistic one, and when they see soldiers dying for imperialism, their views on the war change. Even if Putin manages to maintain control over Crimea and some of the Donbass in the southeast, he will have lost the war, in his opinion, because Russia needs to control all of Ukraine to achieve victory. He explains his perspective on the situation by saying, "I'm looking at it from the point of view of Russian domestic political processes. The Russian people were told that their victory was a simple matter of seizing Kyiv. That did not occur, and it will not occur. Therefore, Putin will lose if he settles for less. As a result of his efforts, now there are unrealistic expectations to fulfill. Say he succeeds in keeping Crimea under his control, which he did before the full-scale invasion in February 2022, he might then claim victory because he held off NATO's forces there. People may believe Putin's propaganda for a while, but eventually they'll realize he lost the war. The people's faith in his invincibility, which is the only thing keeping him in power, will be shaken. If the rumors about Putin's alleged health are true, it may be his demise rather than the oligarchs or the people's efforts to bring him down. Even though there isn't any hard proof that he's sick, Galyamov's convinced there's enough evidence that his health isn't great. According to him, Putin's increasing awareness of his own mortality has driven him deeper into the arms of the Russian Orthodox Church's top officials. The quick taking of Kyiv was obviously going very wrong for him, but he does not look too ill now. I think it had a profound effect on his psyche when he saw that the world had exposed his army as nothing more than a paper tiger. For him, it was a public shaming. He became more religious and superstitious as a result of this. So dubious that he will no longer employ lookalikes, if he ever did. He wouldn't trust a doublo not to make a televised address announcing his resignation or the end of the war, today. He is not as sick as he was in the spring, but his mind is irrevocably altered.